What's up, y'all? Are y'all excited for this Shakur Stevenson versus Teofimo Lopez fight?
I hope so.
Okay. You know, honestly, I didn't think these guys would be in the ring together.
I feel like I'm the next Floyd, the Greats. I'm the next Sugar Ray, all of them. They can hate me. It is what it is.
God damn it! You can't make this shit up.
You know, I never thought that they would be fighting, but it looks like they are. Who do you think is gonna win this fight? You know, I'm gonna be honest with y'all. You know, Shakur Stevenson is a born fighter.
I don't give a fuck.
But you know, I don't think Teofimo Lopez has the willpower to be able to, you know, beat someone like Shakur Stevenson. You know, even though Shakur Stevenson is a born fighter.
But Shakur, that guy will put anybody to sleep outside the ring.
He is a very talented fighter. You know, to a certain extent, you know, he's never really been hurt. You know, people say that he was hurt in his last fight, but you know, I really couldn't see it. You know, maybe it may have been days, but you know, hurt, I don't think so. I've never seen Shakur Stevenson actually hurt.
Gervonta Tank Davis, let's make the fight happen, man. I'm tired of tweeting. I'm tired of talking about it. Stop ducking me and let's make the fight happen, man. Come on.
Brother,
You know, the situation is different for Teofimo though, because we've seen Teofimo Lopez hurt, you know, plenty of times. We've seen him hurt plenty of times. You know, we've seen him hurt against George Kambosos, definitely. You know, honestly, you know, I think this fight is going to go the distance. You know, I don't think, you know, neither fighter will knock each other out. You know, I think Shakur Stevenson, you know, has pillow hands, you know, and I think Teofimo doesn't really have power like that either. So, you know, I think it's going to be more of a chess match. You know, I could see these guys, you know, having a chess match, you know, the first beginning of the rounds. You know, I could see, you know, it being kind of even at first, you know, with Teofimo kind of trying to pick up the pace. You know, I think that Teofimo would probably underestimate Shakur Stevenson, given that he's going up in weight. Most likely, Teofimo is going to try to be the aggressor. He's going to try to be the bully, you know, and take the fight to Shakur Stevenson, given that Shakur Stevenson has came up in weight. You know, and honestly, you know, a reasonable fighter would do that. You know, he would take the fight to him, knowing that he probably is not used to the weight, probably can't handle the weight. You know, we'll just have to see. You know, Shakur Stevenson might be comfortable at this weight. You know, he might have power at this weight. You know, it's hard to tell. We'll just have to see. You know, but as far as the fight going, you know, I have it going to a boring close decision. Decision with Shakur Stevenson taking the fight. You know, it is what it is. You know, Teofimo is a good fighter, but you know, Shakur is just, you know, his defense. You know, he is an annoying fighter to deal with. You know, it's kind of crazy because these guys actually have sparring footage. You know, they actually have sparring footage. You know, you can go check it out yourself. You know, and people like to say, oh, well, sparring don't matter. But, you know, if you box, if anybody box, you know, if anybody ever boxed before, if anybody ever sparred before, you know, I should know I do this. I spar, I train, you know, I was going to compete. You know, if anybody who does this, they should know that, you know, sometimes sparring can be a fight. You know, sometimes sparring isn't always just practice. You know, sometimes, you know, when a guy socks you in the jaw, you know, sometimes it goes there. You know, sometimes it goes there. Sometimes it turns into a fight. You know, and I feel like a spar is way more dangerous, you know, than, you know, being in an actual bout, because, you know, there's no one to break you up. You know, it's just you and that opponent. They don't have a ref to stop the fight. You know, if something bad was to happen, you know, I feel like, you know, it's much more of a risk, in sparring most of the time, because you never know what your sparring partner will do. Shakur Stevenson was winning that sparring session, from what I seen, and like I said, people would say, well, sparring doesn't matter. Well, if we look at Rolly Romero versus Ryan Garcia, Rolly was tagging Ryan, all up in the fight, all up in that spar that they had. It was practically the same thing for the fight. Nothing really changed, and that was when, Ryan was young, and, Ryan was, way older, had more experience, more power, and, it still happened that way. It's like the same thing. I feel like, Rolly had this edge over Ryan, because he did beat him in that spar, and once you beat a guy in a spar, you might feel more confident in fighting this guy. So, my take on it is, Shakur Stevenson might be feeling confident, judging by the spar that he had with Teofimo Lopez. Do I think Teofimo can win? Maybe. It's the only person that can defeat Teofimo Lopez is, Teofimo Lopez. He's gonna have to work. He's gonna have to really work for this fight, because I think Shakur is coming to, prove people wrong. A lot of people, do clown him, say he don't got no power, and I think Shakur, might be trying to, prove the doubters wrong. I think Teofimo will be a good person to add to that list of fighters that, of a good fighter that he actually beat. Well, if we watch the fight, I'm going to be watching the fight. If you're watching the fight, let me know in the comments. Look, man, put your money on Shakur. Even though he's a boring fighter, if you really want to, win, some money, put it on Shakur Stevenson. He's probably going to run all night. It's going to be a very boring victory.